Once you have experienced a genuine spirit contact from a conjuration, it changes you. It changes your perceptions forever. It becomes a matter of certainty, not faith, in your magic.
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. Today, we are going deep into the Grimoire Encyclopaedia with author, researcher, and magician David Rankin. We certainly find ourselves in a grimoiric renaissance in recent years. We have freshly translated grimoires resurrected from their vellum slumber in archives across the world. But with so many grimoires and books of magic floating around, one might wonder, can I explore the grimoires comprehensively? How do you even go about comparing all the magical tools, the names of spirits, and more from one grimoire to another? What actually makes conjuration work? Well, this in-depth exploration, analysis, and cataloging of the grimoire tradition is reflected in David Rankin's latest giant tome from Hadean Press, the Grimoire Encyclopaedia, a work of magical scholarship that includes 100 chapters on individual grimoires and important books spanning hundreds of years. It also includes 16 huge appendixes and a massive spirit catalog. And David Rankin is one of the best people to ask about all of these issues because he's an author, an esoteric researcher, and magician who lives in Weston-super-Mare, England with his partner, artist and tattooist Rosa Laguna. He's been making major contributions to the modern occult revival since the 1980s through lectures, workshops, presentations, articles, and books. And David's esoteric expertise covers a wide range of topics, including the Western esoteric traditions, especially the Kabbalah, the Grimoire tradition, Greco-Egyptian magic, and ceremonial magic, as well as British folklore and European mythology. David's esoteric knowledge and scholarship can be seen in the 32 books that he's authored, his essays in various anthologies, and hundreds of articles for magazines, journals, international works, and websites. In addition to his individual works and research, I first became familiar with David through his collaboration with Dr. Stephen Skinner in the Sourceworks of Ceremonial Magic series of books from Golden Horde. And that series is, to me, just foundational to the understanding and practice of Solomonic magic. Also, a big thanks to each and every Glitch Bottle patron on Patreon for your questions for David and for your support of the podcast. Patrons of Glitch Bottle can also enjoy an after show where David shares more conjuring best practices. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, let's welcome David Rankin. David Rankin, thank you so much for taking the time and stopping by the Glitch Bottle podcast today.
Thanks very much, Alexander. I'm delighted to be here.
Can you share with us a little bit about your background? How did you first become interested in the esoteric? And also, what different groups and solo work have most captivated your interest and your research and your time?
I think it's one of those things that's been there for a very long time. As a young child, I was a very avid reader. And by the age of 6 or so, I'd read through the mythologies of various cultures like the Celtic, Norse, Greek, Egyptian. And when I got to around 10, I discovered my all-time favorite book, the Tao Te Ching. This really had a huge impact on me, and worked my way through the works of Jung, some of which I liked, some I didn't. And then at 14, in one of those interesting moments, I came across a catalogue from Occult, which was an occult bookshop and supplier in England. And I looked at it and I just decided, yep, this is what I'm going to do. I ordered half a dozen books from there, which I got, and started practicing. I think something was clearly guiding my hand, because the first 6 books that I bought on magic were The Key of Solomon, The Grimoire of Armadel, The Sacred Magic of Abramelin the Mage, Techniques of High Magic, Levi's Transcendental Magic, and Crowley's Magic. And this was like no knowledge. It was just, those were the books that jumped out to me that I felt I had to have. I then worked my way through Techniques of High Magic, trying out all the practices, taking the magical vow in the back. Thank you, Stephen. And from then on, I would spend 2 hours a day, every day, practicing meditation, visualization, concentration exercises, trying out the rituals, doing the pentagram ritual, the hexagram ritual, middle pillar, etc. And it kind of flowed from there, really. When I was 18, I was lucky enough to become involved with a magical lodge, which is a very old school lodge. I only got in because somebody who I knew at a sports club noticed I used to wear a little pendant of a silver tree of life. And he asked me about it. And he asked me a question, and I gave an answer. And he said, "That's the right answer. I know somebody you might like to meet." And he took me along to meet the guy who was the master of the temple of the lodge, who sort of interviewed me. And he said, "Right, you're going to come back next week at the same time, and I'm going to ask you a load of questions. If you get them all right, you're in. If you get any wrong, I'm not interested." Fortunately, I got them all right. A lot of them were on correspondences and things which I'd memorized in the preceding 4 years. And so I was then in a very private, old school lodge, which focused heavily on grimoire magic. And so that was a huge influence, really, on my path. A while later, I moved to another area, and you weren't allowed to be part of the lodge if you weren't living locally. So I parted on very good terms with the lodge, and sort of carried on from there. I became involved with other traditions. When I was living in Oxford, I was part of the foundation of the Oxford Golden Dawn Occult Society, which used to run lectures and conferences, but also had a working group working through different ritual magic practices. Got involved with the foundation of a Thelemic group, and years later also was initiated into Alexandrian Wicca and involved with that. So there's been kind of a flow of things over the years, but I've always with the grimoire tradition and Kabbalah as kind of like the underlay or foundation for what I've been doing.
And David, given your years of experience, both practically as well as with research and scholarship, can you share with us a little bit about the genesis of your latest tome from Hadean Press, the Grimoire Encyclopedia? What was missing, or what is missing in the current occult publishing world, so to speak, that perhaps this latest tome can help fill?
The genesis kind of goes back to a conversation with Mog Morgan, a friend of mine who was one of the founders of Oxford Golden Dawn Occult Society and who runs Mandrake of Oxford Press. Back in 2010, he said to me, "This grimoire stuff, I don't really get it. Could you do me a précis of some of the most important texts and explain a bit to me?" So I wrote this document for him, which was, I think, about 30 or so of what I consider to be the main grimoires and a bit about each of them. And so that was kind of the seeds for the Grimoire Encyclopedia. And then over the years, I wrote bits and pieces which have subsequently gone into the Grimoire Encyclopedia. As time went by, and I was seeing this, like you said, this renaissance of more and more material being out there, more being available. It can be quite confusing, particularly to newcomers. And, I remember the first Conjuration I did, which is over 40 years ago. I look back on it now and think, hell's teeth, I would not do it the same way now. Fortunately, it went well. Maybe the beginner's luck, as it were. But I don't think there's anything that really gives a panoramic overview of the tradition and puts things in context and gives a good level of reference and cross-reference, so you can see where the influences are and what the different flavors are, and as a result, what is most likely to appeal to a person coming in. So that was what I wanted to do, is put the material together in a way that it was very easy to access information and also have all the stuff there in the appendixes for reference. So you could just look at something at a glance and go, this spirit, oh, it also turns up in this grimoire, and this grimoire, and this grimoire. Okay, I'm going to go and look at that and see what the context is for it there. Is it the same? Does the nature of the spirit, the way it's presented, change? Consider the whole range, which is vast. And I just wanted to try and, give this overview that would give more clarity to people and make it more accessible. Because a lot of the material, even though there is a lot more stuff now available online, it's still a case of having to go through manuscripts and look at a lot of stuff. And if you're not familiar with the writing style or you don't speak the languages, then that can limit accessibility. And I just wanted to try and open it up as much as I possibly could.
I know for myself, and I know for thousands and thousands of listeners, your work, your individual works, your writings, your collaboration with Dr. Stephen Skinner and the source works of ceremonial magic, I know it's had a huge, huge impact on the understanding of Solomonic grimoiric practices. And I think this is a great time to ask a listener question to that point, David, from Richard Irving, who is saying, "Hi, David. I'm so excited you're coming on Glitch Bottle, having been a huge fan of your work and collaborations with Dr. Stephen Skinner. My question is, does the Grimoire Encyclopedia include multiple grimoires, or how does your book treat individual grimoires and add context?"
Okay, so the 100 chapters, of those 190 or so are grimoires. The other 10 are important works within the grimoire tradition or as precursors to the grimoire tradition. So, for example, there's a long chapter on the Greek magical papyri. There's a long chapter on Supplementum Magicum, which is contemporary to the Greek magical papyri and sort of kind of almost like volume 2 of it, and other works which you can see have an influence into the grimoire tradition. And of course, the Bible, the old elephant in the room that people don't talk about that much, because the Bible is a kind of an essential component in all the material from it that gets used within the grimoires. But how it treats them is, for each of those chapters, there's kind of like a template. So you have the first date of the grimoire, the languages it's published in, influences that can be clearly established from other grimoires and earlier grimoires, the provenance of it, what manuscripts we know exist of it. And that's interesting because often there are a lot more manuscripts of a grimoire than have been commonly thought. I found so many stashed away in various university libraries. It's like, oh, I didn't know that. It's like, I did not know that there was like a dozen or so Abermelin manuscripts, for example. People talk about the French one that Mother's translated, and then George Den's fabulous work on the earlier German text. But there's Italian editions of it, and there's a lot of different manuscripts. So I just kept having my mind blown with how much I was finding out as I was doing. I thought my knowledge was quite good. I learned so much over the last few years, working on the research and writing of this book. But so also whether there's a circle or circles in the grimoire, what tools are used, the spirit list. Then I discussed the text of the grimoire, all the actual bits that are in it, and with context as well, the things that I think are particularly relevant or of interest about the grimoire. So, for example, there might be, I find this is a particular note because, we're seeing a heavy presence of the Virgin Mary in this grimoire, which isn't present in a lot of grimoires, aspects like that. And then essential reading list at the end of books about that particular grimoire that I think are, if you want to work with that grimoire, you need to read this book. So there's a lot of reference to a lot of contemporary writers' works in there that I point people to. So to people like, Joseph Peterson, of course, Stephen's work, Jake Stratton Kent, Dan Harms, Ferrata Ache, all the people, and also the academic works people like Claire Fanger, Robert Matheson, all the people out there doing work and trying to guide people to where they can go to find out more about that individual grimoire, so that if they're going to work it, they're going to have all the best material to hand.
I absolutely love that, because especially for someone just starting out, it's great to jump in, but there's so much background material and understanding and context. Was that One of your goals, David, in putting this together was really to add the behind the scenes information, the context for someone who's either reading a grimoire or researching, or someone who is actually wanting to practice a grimoire.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I started practicing back in 1979, it was a very different world to today. There was a very limited amount of material compared to what there is now. There's no internet. The publishing renaissance had not really started at that point. As a 14-year-old at school, I would avidly wait for catalogues. There was a few magical bookshops around the UK who would put out these little A5 typed catalogues of books, and I would be there waiting for that to arrive in the morning post. And they would usually open at 9 o'clock, so I would be outside school. I'm going to be there a few minutes late today, waiting at the phone box, because again, most houses didn't have phones back then, and there's no mobiles. To bring up and say, I want number 36, number 72, number 89, please, from the list, and we'd either get like, yes, that's still in, I'll mark it off for you. Yes, no, that's already sold, or what have you. And then eagerly waiting for these books, and I used to, work in my spare time and find ways to raise money, and I was spending a lot of money on books as a teenager. I had a very big book collection, but it wasn't that much grimoire material around at the time. Now there is a lot more, and I really wanted to, so like I say, provide like a catalogue of it for people, but in a way that wasn't dry and was accessible and could encourage people towards practice, and give my advice based on my 40 odd years of doing the practice as to what I have found works. I'm not saying it's the only way. I'm just saying, well, this is based on my perceptions and experience, which hopefully you will find of value.
And that is one of the things, David, that I really appreciate about your work and Dr. Stephen Skinner's and others, is that you are on the precipice. You are balancing and merging and mingling not only deep research and scholarship, but it's informed by this very, very practical experience. And you were just chatting about, book catalogs and things like that. This is a great time to ask, for your Grimoire Encyclopedia, how did you research and compile the massive amount of names in your spirit catalog? That could not have been an easy task.
Yeah, there's over 12,500 spirits in the spirit catalog. It is crazily large. I would work on one grimoire at a time, working on the chapter for it. And as I was working on it, I would have multiple files open for all the different appendixes, which every time I came across something as a reference, I would unpack it into the appendixes. So the number, and I said 8 originally on the thing, but it's more like 16 or so appendixes now in there. So anytime I came across a reference to use of a crystal, that went into that appendix. Incense ingredients went into an appendix. Incense and oil recipes went into an appendix. Magical inks went into an appendix. Materia Magica, which is a huge appendix, and one of my favorite parts of the book because it's huge, and also because it's very interesting in there, looking at things like the PGM and the uses, and then seeing similar uses later on in grimoires. Again, so showing a continuity of practice. Another one on magical rings, one on the use of metals, one on all the different plants, the spirit list, of course, one on magic circles, one on timings, one on the tools, one on forms of divination. And, that's something that kind of doesn't get looked at as much. Going through the different grimoires, I think I've listed about 36 different forms of divination that are referenced. There's also some shorter ones, like one on spirit feasts and an example of a spirit contract. So, it was very laborious and time-consuming to go for, to have to keep stopping and adding it in, going to the appropriate appendix. And that's why, it's taken me 3 years to write the book, really. The PGM took the longest. That took me weeks to go through that and unpack every single reference into the appropriate appendixes.
David, one of the things, too, that I have shared with Dr. Skinner and others before is, as someone on the outside, when I think about what you do in terms of research, it's almost like you're sneaking into the basement of the Vatican Library at midnight, being guided by a rebel priest and smuggling out information. But with the reality being, as you say, just having multiple files open, being so meticulous, what got you through that? What powered you through that? Was it massive amounts of coffee or tea? Or where does that motivation come from to meticulously catalog everything? It's great.
Well, I think it's kind of my nature that I like organizing things and I like efficiency. So I have a sort of way of doing things. So on a normal work day where I'm on my sort of daily job, on those days I would make sure that I spent at least 2 hours, in the evening working on the book. On days when I wasn't working, it would be 6 to 8 hours usually. So that every day I put the work in. For me, one of the ways to be consistent as an author is you have to have the discipline. It's just a continuation of magical practice in a sense. Success requires discipline. You have to have that discipline and that endurance and persistence. You just have to keep working at it. Some of the texts, I was going through them, geez, this is going on. But, just keep going and keep going. It's difficult. This book for me is different to other books I've written because in the past, I would normally have a couple of books on the go at a time that I'm writing. And so if I hit a block with one or kind of felt dryness with it, I would switch to the other book and work on that for a period. But with this one, it was so all-consuming that the dryness didn't hit. At times, the feeling it was a bit of a slog hit. But as time went by, and I was like, I hit markers. It's like, okay, I've done 30 of the chapters now. I've done 62 of the chapters now. And when it got to the last 10, because I decided on the 100 as a nice round number because this is a project that could otherwise just go on forever. So I said, okay, I'm going to do 100. And so those last 10, it was kind of like a countdown. Of course, I left a couple of the longer ones till last. So that took a while. But, I do have plans, probably say 5 years or so down the line, I will do another edition. I've already got plans for 16 more chapters to add in for those people who go, but you didn't include this one. Why isn't this one there? I chose texts that I thought were particularly important or interesting. And, other things have come to light, but I was set myself that limit of the 100 so that the book would get out there and hopefully be of value to people. And then further down the line, because I kind of see this book as being my life's work. I will constantly work on it and improve it. And then every so many years put out a new edition with all the extra material in. But the organizational thing, it's funny, there were moments, like for example, when Steve and I were working on the Veritable Key of Solomon, there are 20 different Key of Solomon manuscripts in the Wellcome Library in London. And one of the times that Stephen was over visiting when he was still living out in the Far East, and we were requesting these, and the librarian was like, well, you're only allowed 10 manuscripts out at a time. And quick as a flash, Stephen said, but there's 2 of us, so can we have 10 each? Are you 20? And the librarian laughed and sort of said yes. And we had to put all the tables together in the middle of the room. Fortunately, there was nobody else there. And lay out these 20 different manuscripts of the Key of Solomon, then have a laptop open with a spreadsheet and systematically go through each one and mark off what the chapters were in each of the different ones, so you could see afterwards, like, which ones had come from which and where the influences were. It can be really laborious work. And say, it's not that glamorous a lot of the time when you're doing the research, but it is so necessary. Wow. Also interesting, when we were there in the Welcome, Steve and I would plow through the catalogues looking for things and getting different manuscripts out and look at them. And they used to have little cards back then, talking 2004, 2005, which showed the last person, who had taken out a particular manuscript to look at it. And I saw Clavis Inferni in the catalogue, and I thought, that looks interesting. And I asked to get that one out, and it came out, and nobody had looked at that manuscript for 50 years. And I was like, wow, nobody's looked at it. And I was blown away by the manuscript, and that would have been earlier in the series, but it took Steve and I a couple of years to decipher it all, because that was a cipher manuscript and stuff in various different magical languages, and it was full of contractions, and it was bits in Latin, and then contractions reversed. With help from a couple of other people, like Joe Peterson helped us with a couple of bits we couldn't work out, and another friend of mine, Peter Forshaw, who's a professor who was in London at the time, helped crack a couple of the bits. And so that ended up being volume 5, because it took us a good 2 or 3 years to working on it in the background while we were doing other work like Goetia of Dr. Radden, the Veritable Key, to do bits and pieces on that. But it blew me away that no one had looked at it for 50 years. It just goes to show with some of these manuscripts that they're just sitting there forgotten or ignored. And so, bringing things like that to the light of day for people is something that, you get a huge amount of pleasure from, to know that nobody's looked at that possibly in your lifetime, and you are sort of putting that out into the world.
Wow, David, that is so wonderful. When you were sharing about the collaboration that you have with yourself and Dr. Skinner, of course, but Joseph H. Peterson and many others, I can see that image in my head of yourself and Dr. Skinner in the library pushing the tables together just to hold the amount of Key of Solomon manuscripts there. That is so excellent. And something that you and Dr. Skinner touch on in the Sourceworks of Ceremonial Magic series, David, is what the Solomonic tradition or the transmission of Solomonic techniques are and how they relate to the grimoires. And we often hear of the Solomonic tradition or the grimoiric tradition. How is the grimoiric tradition holistic or comprehensive? Is it right even to use those words, or is this achieved by a similarity in technique or conjuration methods? What can you tell us?
Well, I'd say it's holistic in the sense that it covers a wide spectrum of practices and spirits, but I think a good analogy would be jigsaws. It's like, the different grimoires, most of them, you have to remember, they were like practical books that were written by people, and they were writing the stuff they felt they needed to record. So there can often be material not there, which would make it easier to somebody looking at it now, but that the person who wrote the grimoire, I don't need to write that down because I know that. So it's like you've got a jigsaw, but it doesn't have all the pieces there. However, then you might get another grimoire, which also has a load of pieces, but not the same ones, or some of them are the same, but there are also some different ones, and some of those different ones might actually fit into the jigsaw of the other grimoire and make that clearer. This is something that I'll touch on a bit more later, and there are similarities, certainly, in the techniques and the conjuration methods, but there are also differences. We do see that evolution. The earlier grimoires tend to have a much more religious and sort of angelic feel. You get a lot more reference to the Virgin Mary, for example, who quite quickly almost entirely disappears from the grimoires. And if you look at the later, if you like, French black magic grimoires, things like the Grimoire of Verum, the Grimoire of Pope Honorius, the Red Dragon, they're a lot simpler in style than something like the Swan Book of Honorius. So there are similarities, but there's also, evolution is sort of the right word, but often it's like a simplification, I would say, of the practices into a working system. So I would say it's comprehensive because it does cover a wide range of practice. And yes, certainly there are similarities there. And it's also interesting to see how much the similarities are reflected back through to ancient sort of Greco-Egyptian magic, and even earlier through to Egypt and Sumer, that there are practices which you can see a consistency. You're not claiming it's a direct apostolic line of this went to this person through but you can see an ongoing indication, if you like, of successful practice for those practices to survive and be transmitted over the centuries and even the millennia. And I think the grimoire tradition did was draw on those earlier practices and roots, from Jewish magic and Arabic magic and the Greco-Egyptian, and kind of merge it together within an essentially Christian framework, because it was the religion of the time, and magic tends to take on the religion of the time, and evolve forward.
And David, to that very point, in addition to your research, your context, your scholarship, this latest tome, the Grimoire Encyclopedia, also includes practical wisdom from your literally decades of direct engagement with spirits listed in the grimoires. And to do this, you share in the book a template for conjuration. What inspired you to share some of the key things that you've learned over the years for a successful conjuration?
I wanted to do something to try and give that example for others. Again, I make it clear that it's not the only way or necessarily the best way for everybody, but there's an awful lot of things which experience makes you think are obvious, but they're not necessarily obvious to someone who's not really been practicing much. And there's all sorts of little details which do matter that people might not be aware of, that, aren't written down. And the obvious stuff is often the stuff that needs to be written down. A simple example would be, you see conjurations, and in the conjuration, you'll see like little crosses often, like around, to find names and things. And whenever you see a cross in the text, that means that you should make the sign of the cross. But it doesn't say in the grimoire, by the way, when you see a sign of a cross, make the sign of the cross. And it's not something that tends to be written down. So little things like that, which, like I say, aren't necessarily obvious. I wanted to put all those together, and those little hints and ideas which can, make it more fluid and work better for people. So it was really important to me to put that in, all the things that I felt could be of benefit to people that might, help them with the practice. Because, it is a reference book, but at the end of the day, it's a reference book written with the hope that people will practice based on what they find in there.
David, in your tome, I love this phrase. You talk about magical momentum. What is magical momentum? Is it the same as when Dr. Skinner says that one must build magical tension before and during an operation? And listeners will pick up a copy of your book for full explanation, but you mentioned that, quote, the greater the momentum, the greater the chance of a successful outcome. Can you elaborate on this?
Yeah, it's the same principle. I like to use the word momentum and magical momentum because momentum implies movement. An analogy would be that when you're doing all the practice and preparation, it's like having a magnet. The bigger the magnet, the stronger the attractive pull of the magnet. So all of the things you're doing in the preparation all add to strengthening that magnetism, which is designed to attract the spirit. The whole part of the process of conjuration is, to have a successful communication with the spirit that you're trying to communicate with. So all those things that you do in your preparation, in the gathering of the ingredients, the consecrations, the purifications, the fasting, the whole kit and caboodle is all, building up the magical momentum. There are steps that can be left out, from experience, but anything that gets left out might reduce the momentum. In my experience, with texts, I don't tend to remove things, but I might add things in to add to the momentum. I think that helps with the spirit communication. Like I say, the bigger the momentum. As an example, let's say the spirit was a person going for an interview. If you go for an interview and you turn up at the place and you go in and it looks a bit run down and shabby and you're kept waiting for hours and you have a sort of an interviewer who doesn't seem interested in what you have to say, you're probably not going to want the job. If you go somewhere, it's clean, it's pristine, they're friendly, they're welcoming, you aren't kept waiting, the interviewer engages you, shows interest in you, you are much likely, if you're offered it, to want to go for that job. So it's the same kind of thing. You are building up that momentum with everything that you do in the preparation to show your commitment to the conjuration and to the engagement with the spirit. You're showing that spirit that you are somebody who genuinely wants that communication and respects the spirit, which of course is hugely important. So the process for me of the magical momentum is doing everything you can to ensure a successful outcome, because conjurations don't always work. The spirits don't always turn up, but there is a greater chance of it happening if you put everything you can into all the preparation and then the actual conjuration itself.
Something too, David, that yourself and Dr. Stephen Skinner have written about is the importance that when you first start a grimoire, you should be prepared for hours and hours of initial work in the ritual. Can you share with the listeners, if someone's out there who's very excited about starting a grimoire, they have all the materia magica, they have everything memorized, about the importance of literally putting in hours and hours, because the spirit very likely will not instantly show up?
Yeah, again, if I can use another analogy, imagine somebody phones you on your landline, not your mobile, on the landline. Unless you are sat right next to that phone when it rings, you are not going to pick it up on the first ring. You will hear it from wherever you are in the house. You then have to make your way to the phone to answer it. If you think of those rings as conjurations, it can take a few recitations of a conjuration to get the spirit's attention and bring it to the metaphorical phone to actually answer and engage with you. And it can, like I say, take a long time, and they don't always come to visible appearance, which people can be quite disappointed if they've never done a conjuration. They do their first one, they don't see anything. But just because a spirit isn't visible, it doesn't mean it's not present. There's something that Steve and I have talked about, and I think he might have mentioned in one of his books, that if you go back to the ancient world, there were times where, for example, there's a Jewish practice of having bowls of water on the outside of the circle, and what you ask the spirit when it goes to knock one of the bowls over as proof it was there. I've had instances where I've asked for proof of the spirit's presence when it departs because I've not seen it tangibly, and the candles on one side of the room all blew out at the same time, or no bowl got blown over, no candles went out. I was a bit disappointed, thinking, oh, okay, maybe that was a bit of a bust. Did I do something wrong in the preparation? Then when I was taking the remains of the candles, the sort of stubs that were left out of the candle holders, the bottom of one of the candles, there was a sigil on it that had not been there before the ceremony started. And I was like, oh, okay, you were here and you've actually just given me a sigil for direct communication with you. Thank you very much. But it's only because it's part of my sorting out afterwards process, take all the candles out. Generally, if I will dispose of the candles afterwards, I'm not going to use them for a different conjuration. But as I'm taking them out to look at, I just noticed at the bottom, there's like a sigil on the bottom of the candle. It can take a long time. And there's two other things I would say in here, one of which is there is nothing wrong if a ritual is taking hours and hours with sitting down, because for some people, standing up for hours and hours might be uncomfortable. And if you start to get uncomfortable, you can lose focus. But also conjuration, by and large, is a group tradition. You usually want preferably at least 2, 3 is a good number for a conjuration, because it's hard to do it all by yourself and keep the level of focus that you need. Having one person do the conjuration, second person to be the seer, and you could have a third person as the scribe to record what the seer says. The conjurer can also be the scribe and can be done with 2. But 2 or 3 people, preferably, for the conjuration. If you've got to do it all, you've got to do the conjuration and you've got to be the seer, and then you've got to remember what's said afterwards, because you can't, it's going to be very difficult to ask a question, get an answer, stop, write it down, and expect the spirit to just hang around while you, hang on, let me just write all this down. Are you still there? Can I ask you another question? So it's important to bear in mind that it works best with a small group of people when you're doing conjuration, and that everybody there needs to put the work in for the magical momentum. Everyone needs to be doing the purification. Everyone needs to be doing the fasting. It's a group effort, which is only going to be as strong as the weakest link. So, yeah, it is an ongoing process of practice. And, if you're a newcomer by yourself, it can be disheartening when you've got to do it all and then think, well, I didn't get the results I was hoping for. You have to persist with the best will in the world. I've done conjurations where I thought I did everything right. I put all the preparation in. I fasted. I did everything. Did the daily prayer and bathing, etc. And the spirit didn't turn up. Maybe it had other things to do. I don't know. It didn't turn up. It didn't send another spirit in its place. And I was like, okay, I'll try again another time. And the next time I tried, some months later, it did work. So you have to not get disheartened, and not expect Hollywood-style special effects.
David, thank you so much for those incredibly powerful reminders about the time that it takes, but also the fact that there's a division of roles, and having a scribe and a conjurer and a scryer. It'd be just absolutely wonderful. I also know one magician who I've had the pleasure of working with who places coins around the ritual space perched just at the edge and asks the spirits to push the coins as a sign of their presence, which I think is just so great. Also, David, something yourself and Dr. Skinner and others have mentioned is the importance of paying attention to subtle signs during a ritual that some people might not think are signs at all, but it could be a drop in temperature, it could be lights kind of beating or dancing outside of the circle. Do you find that people who might be a little bit newer to grimoire conjuration, they might need to really pay attention to those subtle signs?
Yeah, absolutely. And having to pay attention to the subtle, but also remain focused on what you're doing is difficult. When you're doing a conjuration, you get quite inflamed and absorbed in the conjuration. If you are being the seer and looking into the crystal ball or a mirror, everything else outside of that is peripheral. It's not really part of what you're focusing on. So having that small group thing makes a huge difference. Also, afterwards, everyone to write up and compare before there's any possible cross-contamination of, I saw this, oh yeah, I think I saw that too, and people persuading each other. You record first, and then you notice, oh yeah, two of us felt that sort of temperature drop over on that side of the room. It wasn't just me. So there's an indication. It's very important to keep a degree of skeptical pragmatism, that you're not just trying to convince yourself of stuff, but that there are tangible effects. And having more than one person does make it easier, because different people have got, their different jobs at different times. Having even more than three, having a fourth person who might, for example, keep the incense going and be specifically keeping an eye on everything around, works really well. Yeah, it's one of those things, it's very much a learning process. And, the more you do it, the more you get a sense for, the subtle changes and, how things work and how things can change very quickly as well. You can be doing something for a period of time. You might have done a conjuration 3 times and nothing has happened, and you do it the 4th time and boom, suddenly everyone in the room's hair on the back of their neck goes up, and the person who's the seer is like, okay, yep, I can see the spirit in the crystal, so time to start asking questions, conjurer. It can flip very quickly, but those long periods that can occur, again, if you're not experienced, it can be disheartening that, oh God, nothing's happening, so I just give up now. And if for any reason you do decide to stop, or if you, at the end of it, it's very important to remember that license to depart, and so that you're clearing the space, because sometimes other things are attracted, or like I say, the spirit isn't actually present there, so in a tangible form, but it is still around.
So many incredible things to keep in mind. And in addition to these practical tips, David, your tome, the Grimoire Encyclopedia, also includes novel and modern instructions that people don't usually think about. For example, the consecration of glasses or contact lenses. Can you share, David, about why is it so important to make sure that any personal jewelry or anything that we don't take off beforehand that we bring into the circle needs to be consecrated before the ritual?
Spirits don't like uncleanliness. So if things aren't cleaned, and consecration is a form of cleaning, then that might be seen as being disrespectful. There's a lovely in William Lilly, the 17th century astrologer's autobiography, he talks about these different characters who were in London at the time, like magician and cunning men. And he talks about one gentleman who used to conjure demons for money for an audience, and that they didn't like him because he would get drunk and he also wouldn't be clean. And so if the spirits did turn up, they tended to rebuke him and tell him off because they weren't happy with the lack of respect he was showing them. The idea of cleanliness is stressed repeatedly in the grimoires, not just of personal hygiene. I think where he even talks about things like cutting your nails and the bathing and the side of it, but everything that's present should have a high degree of cleanliness, and consecration is spiritual cleanliness. Jewelry, particularly, more than most things, tends to hold the effects of the environment as well. It's usually made of metals, might have crystals in it, and those are substances which tend to absorb influences more easily. So from that perspective, it is important that things are consecrated. I did the consecration of glasses and contact lenses back in the 90s. It's based on Trithemius's consecration of the crystal, because, it hit me that people did go in just wearing things like that. I mean, I myself had been guilty of it up until that point. I didn't think about it. And I used to wear contact lenses back then. And so whenever I bought contact lenses, I would keep one daily disposables, and I'd have one batch that I would keep separate, and I would just consecrate them, the whole lot, and then, wrap up the container and pop them in before I was about to do any sort of magical work, not just conjuration, but other magical work as well. And it also kind of takes me on to another thing that I think is important, which is the grimoires are from over a period of many centuries, but the magic tends to use the technology of the age. And so there is nothing wrong with adding in things like this. I actually think it's important to consider the context of our modern age. In the section on the fasting part in the practice chapter, I talk about not just normal fasting, but also electronic fasting, that in the time where you're fasting before doing a conjuration, you should also abstain from social media and not be gaming and going on YouTube or TikTok or things like this, because they are distractions. And the whole point of view of the fasting and that preparation period before the conjuration is to give you that single-pointed focus. So you need to have that electronic fast for the mind as well as the fasting for purifying the body. You're purifying your mind by staying away, which wasn't an issue, obviously, back in the 16th century. But now in the internet age, people have levels of addiction to social media and being online or gaming or other things. That is something else that needs to be removed in the preparation to doing conjuration, which wasn't an issue in the past, like I say, but now it's one of those things that people might not think about, but is very important, I would say, because having that mental focus is essential for successful conjuration.
I absolutely love that about the modern adaptability and meeting in the 21st century where the operators are to successfully engage with spirits. We also have a Glitch Bottle Patreon listener question for you, David, from Emma Keitler. And Emma is asking and saying, what is one thing or fact about your occult specialties that's obscure but should be more widely known? And Emma is asking, what is a mystery, David, you want to solve but haven't been able to yet? Emma says, I think these two questions are essential to furthering religious and magical practices.
Okay, one thing that's obscure from the point of view of it's not something that's talked about in the grimoires, but I think is essential, is shutting off the internal dialogue. When I was 21, I experienced that state of dharana, the shutting off the internal dialogue where you just have the silence in your head. And it was after an Ogdos ritual, and I realized that it was just wonderful peace in my head and silence. And I also realized that I could then do that at any time. It was like a switch had been flipped. So after 7 years of daily concentration, meditation exercises and things, I'd reached the point where I could do that. So for the last 36 years or so, I have happily lived with constant silence in my head unless I feel the need to discuss something with myself. You can shut off the internal dialogue at will. Also, particularly if you're in the role of the seer, you can then tell if you are having a genuine spirit communication, because often, the spirits will speak into your head, and that it's not just an internal ego dialogue of you talking to yourself, because you know what your internal voice sounds like and you have shut it off. So if a voice then speaks into your head, you know that you are having a genuine spirit communication. So I think doing the concentration, the meditation exercises and things as part of your training is a really good thing to do if you want to do grimoire practice, so that you can shut off your internal dialogue at will. And like I say, it's a good way to have a better idea that you are having genuine spirit communications. With regard to a mystery I haven't solved yet, I would say what happens at the moment of death is a mystery that I haven't solved yet, and hopefully won't for decades to come yet. But I think it's a question that's intrigued man since time immemorial, and there's lots of speculation, but I don't think it's something you can actually know until you experience it for yourself, when you have that transition from where we are now in our physical body to, whatever comes after that.
Well, David, I certainly echo that I hope you do not put the magnifying glass to that specific mystery for many, many decades to come. And we also have a Glitch Bottle patron listener question for you from Douglas of the What Magic Is This podcast, who is asking, I don't really have anything to ask except to perhaps just say thank you to David for doing this. Oh, Douglas says, maybe one question. The Armadel grimoires, in his opinion, are they actual working grimoires, Douglas is asking, or some sort of fraud or forgery or novelty grimoires?
I don't think that they are. I know people who have worked with the Grimoire of Armadel and got good results over a period of many years. What I would say with the Grimoire of Armadel is that, again, like many grimoires, it doesn't appear to be a complete work. But if you look at this particular one, and we'll dive into it a little bit more, it has material in it from the Heptameron, from the Arbatel, from the Grimoire of Pope Honorius, and from Agrippa's work, which implies that whoever created the Grimoire of Armadel was widely read. And interestingly, the Heptameron and the Grimoire of Pope Honorius, there are copies of them bound in with the same manuscript. So when you then consider that, the material that are in those is kind of largely covers the areas that are missing from the Grimoire of Armadel. So the fact that they are bound together suggests that, well, I don't need to put this bit in because it's in the Heptameron bit that's in front. For example, this particular aspect of the magic circle, or what have you, is covered in the Heptameron. So why do I repeat it again in here? It's also an interesting text in the permeating level of Kabbalah in it, the Kabbalistic influence, which you don't really see in most grimoires, except maybe the 9 celestial keys. There's a lot of Kabbalistic material set within the context of biblical scripture, and it's full of Kabbalistic references, to the paths of wisdom, to the diabolic Cliffot. And then there's a very interesting group of spirits in there, which you don't see anywhere else, who derive from the first 9 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. You've got like Alepta, for Aleph, and Betel for Bet, Gimela for Gimel, etc., all associated with significant biblical events. And it's like, that makes you, why is it the first 9 letters of the Hebrew alphabet? My speculation is that the first 9 letters makes you think about the Egg-Becker square that's used for sigil creation. And the Grimoire of Armadel is so sigil heavy that could be a connection. That is just a speculation. But it is worth remembering, for anyone who does decide to work with the Grimoire of Armadel and try and call up those spirits, that with it being so Kabbalistic, the Zohar does describe all the Hebrew letters as being female. So it is quite possible that you might get the spirits appearing in a female form. I have not done it. This is just a speculation on my part. Just let me be clear about that. I just wanted to throw that in. But it's got a very diverse spirit list as well. There's classical archangels, previously unknown angels, Olympic spirits, demons, these alphabet spirits, and also concept spirits, like the spirits of the path of wisdom, spirits of force and counsel, spirits of joy, angels of love and charity. So I do think it's a real grimoire. I don't think it's a fraud or a novelty grimoire. Also, there's more than one example of the Grimoire of Armadel. There's at least 3. There's the 2 in the Bibliothèque Nationale, and there's a German edition that's in a private collection. So for a book that's not got many known editions, it's also interesting that the material has travelled. A friend kindly drew to my attention that there are some bits in the Grimoire of Armadel in a Paulo Mayembe handbook, which is in the Library of Havana in Cuba. So a bit of the Grimoire of Armadel has made its way there and been incorporated into somebody's Paulo Mayembe practices. So, yeah, that's an interesting example to choose, the Grimoire of Armadel. I certainly don't think that it's a fraud or a forgery, although I've not really worked with it much myself. I did a little bit in my early days and didn't get good results, but that might be because I'd only been practicing for a year or two. I have friends who I know are experienced magicians who have worked with it for many, many years, who swear by it and have had sustainably good results working with the Grimoire of Armadel.
And David, to that very point, you mentioned that, quote, experience shows that it is not a good idea to start changing a system, a grimoire system, until you are competent in that system and fluid in its practices. On this note, experience suggests, you say, that it is often better to add to rather than take away from an existing structure. And David, you touched on this before, but can you elaborate that in today's day and age of synthesizing grimoires or practices, why is this tried and true advice of not initially changing a system so important?
Well, I think you really need to have a good grasp of any magical system before you start, altering it or trying to change things in it. If I can use another analogy, I do like analogies. If your car broke down and there's a problem with it, you're not going to try and fix the engine until you've learned something about car mechanics and how to fix engines. Chances are, if you are going to learn about car mechanics, you're going to learn from an experienced mechanic who shows you the most efficient and tested ways to do that and to fix your car. Once you are familiar with how it works, then you might think, oh, well, actually, I could, I might be able to do this to actually enhance the performance of my car. But until you know, you wouldn't just open the engine and go, oh, maybe if I just take this part off and stick another random item on it, my car will still work, because it probably won't. So, yeah, I think having knowledge of how the system works and why it works and the underlying flows of the system enable you to then make changes. And because I think a lot of the grimoires, like I say, don't have completion, some of them are complete tomes in themselves, but a lot of them, you can see there are elements that could have been added, but were probably known by the person, so they didn't feel to add them. So I suppose there's a slight element of reconstruction there by adding in things that you can see will add to the magical momentum of working in there. I mean, for example, adding in an extra prayer, for example, is unlikely to have a negative effect. One of the things I do is like a consecration of the seer that's done before the actual conjuration. And that's something that you only find in one grimoire, but it's not something that's going to harm the flow. And again, you are adding to the magical momentum and helping induce in your seer the best possible state to be, a seer. And so from that perspective, I think there are elements which I cover quite a lot in the practice chapter that could be added positively to any of the grimoire conjurations without any detriment. But if you start taking the bits out, you could be taking out a vital part of the process if you don't have the familiarity to know why it is there.
To that very point, David, we have a question from Glitch Bottle patron and supporter Lotus Occultus, who is asking and saying, David, I absolutely love your work. I have a question about the infernal hierarchy. On the one hand, Lotus says, yourself, David, and Dr. Skinner mentioned that one should not change a grimoire when starting out and follow step by step until they know what they can change. But on the other hand, in the Goetia of Dr. Rudd, yourself and Dr. Skinner say that there are important missing parts of the Lemegeton's Goetia ritual, like the form of adjuration to say before calling forth spirits. So my question, Lotus says, is, would you, David, recommend newcomers only follow the Lemegeton's Goetia or incorporate other elements? Thank you.
Yeah, well, on the one hand, you can generate enough magical momentum without incorporating them. I mean, in my years I have done, and Goetia is one of the grimoires I've worked with more. I haven't worked with all the grimoires. I've worked with certain ones I have particular favourites. So Goetia is one that I've worked with more. And I have had good success prior to adding in those elements by following all of the other parts of the preparation and purification, etc. However, I would say if you trust the opinion and the experience of the people making the suggestion, in this case, for example, Stephen and myself, you could incorporate them using the analogy of, that car mechanic explaining a simple fix for your car that's going to make it run better. You trust that mechanic to give you good information that is going to make your car run better. So I would say if you feel, yes, I think that what they've said is good and will contribute and will make it better, then incorporate it. If you think, okay, well, it's worked well so far, it doesn't need to have that added, again, you could also do that. I think it's a matter of choice in that, I was doing Goetic ritual for many years before I came across the Goetia of Dr. Rudd, and I did have good success with it. Another thing I would add in here is that, I have done a number of Goetic conjurations. I have not worked with all 72 of the spirits. I do not see the point of it. You find the one that is going to be the one that works for what you are trying to achieve and work with it. And then generally you will develop a relationship with that spirit. I've worked with a few of them, but not the majority, because to me, I don't see any purpose in going, all right, I'm going to conjure all 72 spirits, because apart from anything else, conjuration is not something that you can just do every day. It takes a lot of preparation and planning, and there needs to be a good purpose for it. There's a lot of things that can be achieved without needing to do conjuration, and there are other practices in the grimoires. So I think it's a matter of personal trust here. Do I trust the people making those suggestions? I certainly think adding extra things in does benefit, but if you want to go with what is already there, yes, in the case of the Goetia, it does work. Many people have had success with it without adding them in, but as with most magical practice, all magical practice, the more you can shift the probability of success in your favor, I personally think, the better.
And so, David, because of all this context and all of the background that you're providing, both here in this podcast and also with the Grimoire Encyclopedia, can you share with us what are 2 or 3 things that you find people often misunderstand or don't quite apprehend about grimoires or the grimoire tradition? And then also, what are 2 or 3 things that you think people should always keep in mind when they are researching or practicing the grimoire tradition?
Okay, I think most misunderstood things. One is the assumption that the grimoires are all about conjuration. When you take a panoramic view over them, what has become clear to me, like 3 interwoven threads through the grimoires. They're not all present in every grimoire. If you take the tradition as a whole, there's 3 main elements, which is conjuration, divination, and simple charms. As I mentioned earlier, I found something like 36 different forms of divination mentioned and described across the grimoires. And the simple charms, because a lot of things don't need huge fixes. This like the simple charms for doing things for daily life, for those improvements. And you'll often find through the later grimoires and the French ones, you get all these charms at the end. But grimoires would often be bound with like books of secrets, which are full of simple charms that don't require complex ingredients, that use simple ingredients that are easily gathered, don't require lots of preparation. Most of them don't even necessarily work with particular spirits and might not have any spirits involved for dealing with day-to-day stuff. Conjurations are usually to achieve a big result, for something you particularly need to have as part of the sort of flow of your life direction. So that's one thing that I think people sometimes misunderstand and think grimoires are just about conjuration, because they're not. Another is appreciation of the nature of relationships with the spirits, because when you do start working with particular spirits, often it's an ongoing thing and you develop a relationship with the spirit. And from that point of view, I'd like to say that, as we've just had the Goetia mentioned, it's a good time to mention it. I am not a fan of coercive work with spirits. In all my years, my conjurations, I have never once had to do the coercive cursing stuff with the spirit. I am much more a fan of cooperation and developing, if you like, a symbiotic relationship, a relationship of mutual respect with the spirit, which is much more likely to engender positive results. For me, that is something that is part of a bygone age, and I don't like that. I've never had to do it. It's just something that does not engender a good relationship with a spirit if you have to go into that whole I'm going to curse you and do nasty things to you side of things. The idea that you can just switch it up is something that people can misunderstand. Like the classic one I've heard a lot is, well, I don't like Christian stuff, so I'm just going to, replace all the God names with, I don't know, names from the Book of the Law or something and stick them around the triangle and it'll be fine. But at best, probably nothing will happen. At worst, it could go badly wrong. So understand like I say, it's back to that thing of understanding the system and not assuming that things weren't there for a reason, and you can just, switch it up however you want. And really, if you've got that much of an issue with Christianity, you probably shouldn't be doing grimoire stuff, because it is the cosmology, by and large, that almost all of the grimoires, not absolutely every single one, but almost all of them are set within, is a Christian cosmology. And at the end of the day, 1,500 years or so, Christianity is by far the biggest magical battery out there for people in the West practicing magic. That is something to bear in mind. The angels and the saints and spirits in Christianity have been fed way more than the old pagan gods in the last 1,500 years. They're way more accessible and way more likely to be able to get what you want done. Things to keep in mind. Well, we've kind of already touched on this, but I think it's worth repeating that it's hard work and can be quite demanding doing conjuration. And don't get disappointed if you don't get immediate results. One of the things that I talk about a bit in the practice chapter is the use of incense. And that for some people, if they've got asthma or breathing conditions, incense can be a problem. From that point of view, it's actually the fragrance that attracts the spirits rather than just the smoke. And there is no reason why you can't make, rather than use essential oils to make up, I think, and use oil burners rather than incense, which are less likely to cause problems for people who do have any issues with their lungs. So it is important to keep in mind that we can use the technology of our time. I mean, probably virtually everyone out there has used the internet to look for books on the grimoires or look at texts. We are using modern technology, and we shouldn't be afraid to, update where it's relevant and it's useful. And what I said as well about grimoires were often somebody's workbook, so they left out things that they were familiar with and didn't need to record. And that can lead to apparent contradictions between grimoires, where one says this and then you go to another one and it says something that seems to jar with that. And if you find that, then you need to go with what feels right for you and has a logic and coherence that makes sense to you. And one of the things I wanted to do with the Grimoire Encyclopaedia was put all this material there so you could see, as a reader and a practitioner, what you were drawn to. Do you like the more religious, heavily angelic stuff? Do you like working with the demons a bit more? And a lot of misconceptions jump in with people, and the whole thing of, demons are bad. Well, for myself, I have not found demons to be bad. Tricky at times, but personally, I actually found demons tend to be, for example, more talkative than angels. Angels to give you the absolute minimum information that they need to. They're doing a job. Once they've done their job, they're gone. Whereas demons, okay, maybe sometimes it's to try and confuse you, but at the same time, they tend to be a lot more communicative. And I found that one can get a lot of information out of them if you establish that positive relationship. I've even had demons that I have developed a positive relationship with preempt me asking them to do something and done the thing for me. I've then made offerings and thanked them afterwards when I found out they have, but that they had actually acted on their own initiative to prevent a bad situation for me. Good example here. many years ago, back in 2005, I was virtually living in the British Library. From Monday to Friday, I would be there by 10 o'clock when it opened until 5 in the afternoon, looking at manuscripts, making notes, recording stuff, going through books in the main part of the library that I'd order in to look at to find references. And I used to do that every day. I did that every day for years, and it was wonderful. But in 2005, one day, I had my laptop and I was just about to walk out the door to go and get the train to get into London to King's Cross to walk to the library. And one of my spirits just said to me, "Don't go today." So I shut the door, I went back in, and started working on material I had there and put the radio on. And then a little while later, the announcement came over. That was the day of the London bombings. That was like 7th of July. And the train that was bombed in King's Cross Station, where the bomb went off, was the train that I would have been on. It was the one that got in at that particular time that I always got in the morning that got in at that time. It was on the London Underground. And the spirit had warned me not to go. If I hadn't been warned, I would have been on the train where the bomb went off. So there's an example of, because I had cultivated a relationship with the spirit over a period of time, it looked out for me. It gave me that warning. It was just very simple, but do not go and get on that train today. I didn't. And as a result, I'm still here.
Well, David, I can feel the gravity of that situation as you were describing it, and that vital information that came to you based on that ongoing relationship that you had with the spirit. And this brings up the question, what are some things after you have an initial contact with the spirit and after you establish mutually agreed upon terms, what are some things that you can do to facilitate or maintain those long-term relationships with spirits? Could it be something like giving incense, offering incense once a week to a spirit, or other offerings that the spirit has indicated it would like? What are some tips that you have?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say those things. If you're working with angelic spirits and develop a relationship, another thing which goes down very well with them is what would have been called the offering of alms, giving money or time to charities to help other people is one that helps facilitate that relationship because it increases the respect from the spirit. The main one really is the offerings, and also if they give you a particular name and sigil to call them with, that helps facilitate it a lot. It's interesting because I talked about how it can be really hard work and it can go on for hours. There are also instances where, I've been present where a spirit turned up before the conjuration had even finished. So you get the whole spectrum. The spirit actually had, unknown to anyone there, for some reason, it liked the person. The person had no knowledge of this spirit, but this spirit just made it clear that it felt an affinity to the person doing the conjuration. I was the seer for that particular conjuration. And so halfway through the conjuration, it was there. And it was like, whoa, I've never experienced that before, but something about the person who was doing the conjuration, the spirit felt a real affinity for. So it was very happy to have been called and turned up so fast. That would be the example of someone actually sitting by the phone when it rang. It's never happened for me. That wasn't me that it turned up for. It was the person doing the conjuration. But the spirit had like a real, so I say, fondness for her.
And David, to that very point, what tips do you have for people out there to overcome analysis paralysis? So, for example, when it comes to someone who's following the Heptameron Grimoire, that's written in a Catholic context, and it says you should go to confession and you should receive communion. But what if you're not Catholic? Do you go to confession anyway, or do you say one of the confession prayers from the Key of Solomon? Can you just share any tips about, yes, following the grimoire step by step, but also not getting paralyzed by not following every single requirement if it doesn't apply in a specific situation?
Yeah, absolutely. The confession one is a good one because, yes, personally, I am not a Catholic, so I would not go to Catholic confession. I tend to follow that example, like say from the Key of Solomon, or if it didn't feel appropriate, do a personal confession, because I've heard people complain saying, oh, but that implies that, you're a sinner and blah, blah, blah. No, the point of confession is part of the purification, and it's also about humility. The last thing you want to do going in there is be like wrapped up in that ego attitude of I'm a mighty magician, because that's not what it's about. So the confession helps instill that sort of humility in you, because at the end of the day, you are developing the relationship from a point of view of mutual respect. So if you go in with this superior I'm so mighty attitude, again, that's not going to sit well with the spirits, and it's far less likely to create a successful long-term relationship with the spirits. So, I really hope that template I've given will help people with this, because, I've broken it down into the different parts and sort of explored things that I think are particularly good to add in, but that can be applied into any of the grimoires. So if they go, oh, actually, yeah, that makes sense, I can do that, or I can do this, rather than, they say, get too wrapped up in something to the extent of not doing it. Humans don't tend to like change. Conjuration is very much a process of change. And so you can't allow yourself to put obstacles in your way. If you do put them in the way, you have to remove them again. It's very easy to find reasons not to do something, but it's very important to find reasons to do something.
David, your Grimoire Encyclopedia, as you've mentioned, it covers hundreds and hundreds of years in history in the grimoire tradition. And we have a listener question for you from Glitch Bottle patron JT Lopez, looking towards the future as well. And JT is asking, what has been, David, in your opinion, the most significant idea or contribution to the Western esoteric tradition since the 20th century? Where do you see Western esotericism headed in the 21st century? The current occulture has, in a way, canceled the psychological spirit model. What are your thoughts on this? JT is asking.
For me, I would say the most significant idea or contribution since the 20th century is the influence of people paying attention to the ATRs, which has led to a resurgence of the attitude of a symbiotic spirit relationship and attention to the dead, to the ancestors, familial ancestors, lineage ancestors, tradition ancestors. A living tradition honors its dead. And I think that is a really important thing that has come through from the African traditions, that people have taken more on board in the last 20 odd years. And that's been a very positive change in attitude. Like the dead aren't there just to be honored for one day at Samhain or what have you. The dead are there always. And so for me, it's a very important change that has been emphasized from those traditions, that has been taken on board more into the Western esoteric tradition. As we go into the 21st century, I see much more of an increase in folk magic and more spirit-based magic, which I think is a really good thing, because the psychological spirit model, I think, actually did a lot of harm. I think Crowley has a lot to answer for that with his Goetia, where he talked about it as a psychological model. I think Crowley was a bit wrapped up in Freud's views at the time. Once you have experienced a genuine spirit contact from a conjuration, or possibly in other circumstances in your life, it changes you. It changes your perceptions forever. It becomes a matter of certainty, not faith, in your magic. And so the increase in spirit-based magic is something I'm delighted about, because for me, hopefully that will increase the level of people, A, working with spirits, B, engaging in the practice rather than paying lip service to the practice and just having the paraphernalia of the practice and knowing the buzzwords, but actually doing the magic. Because I'm a great believer that the more people that do magic and radiate that into their environment and their lives, the better. Because I see those relationships with spirits and with the dead as being essential to our development as a species, which in a lot of ways is going backwards at the moment, and needs to be pushed forward by listening to those non-physical entities which have so much for us to learn from. So, yeah, that would be what I think is the most important influence in and where I think it's going. I'm really glad to see that the grimoire stuff has become more popular because it does encourage a discipline, which I think is vital for any magical practice. You know, in the age of instant gratification, where you can order food to be delivered, you can order stuff from Amazon to have it the next day, the grimoires teach us that you have to work hard for the things that matter. So the increase in grimoire magic, I'm also obviously very happy about.
And David, I know I am so thankful that yourself and Dr. Stephen Skinner and so many others are leading the charge and sharing your wisdom on this. And, you know, as you were navigating the Byzantine labyrinths of the grimoire tradition in putting together this book, David, and as you were researching and categorizing and providing context, what was the most difficult aspect of putting this book together? Or maybe what was one of the most surprising things to you that kind of jumped out of the blue? Anything that comes to mind?
Finding grimoires I didn't even know existed surprised me. I was like, oh, wow, that's interesting. I'd never come across that before. I've never ever heard anyone mention it before. Great, that's got to go in there. Finding the depth of material that is out there that I wasn't aware of. You know, there's a bibliography and there's a manuscript bibliography, and the manuscript bibliography goes, I think, probably past 1,000. So for any of those grimoires, you know, you can look at, okay, there's 3 or 15 different grimoires, and that's where they all are, and that's what the reference to find them is. So that really was quite an eye-opener. And what was surprising was, I suppose, which spirits pushed me to work on the Grimoire Encyclopedia. That was interesting as well, because it wasn't the ones I expected.
Listeners as well, definitely check out the podcast and video descriptions below to pre-order your own copy of the Grimoire Encyclopedia from Hadean Press. And David, I know we have a brief after show that Glitch Bottle patrons can enjoy over on patreon.com, but just as we wrap up the main podcast here, David, can you share with listeners about where can people support your work? How can they get more information? And what else are you working on?
It's my website, davidrankin.com, which I haven't worked on for a while, but I have said to myself this year I'm going to do more work on. I plan on putting a load of material on there, doing a sort of like a library of like articles that I've put in anthologies and other works that people might not be aware of onto. Obviously the publishers who have published my work, you know, I publish generally with Hadean now, so there's them. Golden Horde, obviously, with Stephen. Mandrake of Oxford published one of my books. I published a lot in the past with Avalonia. So, yeah, those are really the places where you're going to get them. Of course, Amazon and other places and bookshops will have the books, but those are the publishers who you can go to direct to get hold of my books. With regard to other thoughts, the grimoires, you don't have to be an expert and you shouldn't be frightened to go into it. And what I would say is if you are new coming in, personally, I would encourage you to go to the Armadel, because not only does it have a lot of discussion of the ethics and philosophy, which is very important, but in my experience, the Olympic spirits are some of the easiest spirits to contact as a first contact, and the most temperate and laid back to work with of the spirits by their nature. If you look at the descriptions, most spirits tend to be considered airy or sometimes fiery, whereas the Olympic spirits are made up of all 4 elements in combination. Yeah, if you're going in and you're going, where do I start? I would say the Olympic spirits are a really good starting point for conjuration. But also to remember, like I say, that it's not, the grimoire tradition isn't just conjuration. And there's a lot of simple charms and things. I love the Psalms. I think the Psalms are very beautiful and they have a real magic to them. It's really interesting whether you do them in Latin or English or French or Hebrew, whatever. You can still feel the power there in them. And so Psalm charms are great, in my opinion, for that sort of thing, for those simple results. And I would also encourage people then, if they want to do more sort of charm-based magic that gets them good results, that doesn't require all the preparation of conjuration, to remember that is also a part of the grimoire tradition.
The Grimoire Encyclopedia absolutely will be such a vital tome for those interested in researching and exploring the grimoires, so definitely make sure to check out all of the links below. Author, grimoire researcher, magician David Rankin, his latest tome from Hadean Press is the Grimoire Encyclopedia. David, thank you so much just for taking the time and sharing your wisdom on the Glitch Bottle podcast today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for asking me, Alexander.
Listeners and Glitch Bottle patrons and supporters, I hope you enjoyed the podcast as much as I did with David Rankin. Definitely check out the podcast and video links below to pre-order your own copy of the Grimoire Encyclopedia. David's wisdom and his encouragement to dive into the grimoires, to overcome mental paralysis, and to broaden our horizons in this incredible tradition is much needed now more than ever. Study the traditions, find a grimoire that resonates with you, and delve your esoteric spade deep into the rich earth of spirit engagement. Also, on patreon.com/glitchbottle, David spends a little more time with podcast supporters about the 3 P's of grimoire practice. So if you'd like to support the podcast with exclusive perks, please consider hopping on the Glitch Bottle caravan at patreon.com/glitchbottle. As always, this is Alexander F. reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.